It was just an amazing experience for me, and I got to tell this because it's true, and it's just funny.
At 90 years old, Jeannie Seely has outlived everyone who tried to silence her. With nothing left to lose, the queen of the Grand Ole Opry is finally breaking her silence about a powerful man, a mysterious room called 6B, and a box of letters she kept hidden for 50 years as her insurance policy. What happened behind that locked door cost her everything, but she documented every detail. The truth, as it turns out, is far more shocking than the legend. A legend from the beginning. Long before the whispers, long before a locked door defined her career, and certainly long before a blue dress turned to ash, Jeannie Seely was just a girl from Pennsylvania. Her hands were calloused from hard work, and her voice was a force of nature, way too big for her small steel mill town. You see, her father was a mill worker, a man whose lungs were slowly blackened by the very steel that fed his family. He'd come home each evening covered in soot, his shoulders bent from 12-hour shifts, but his eyes would light up whenever he heard his daughter sing. Her mother sang church hymns while scrubbing floors, not just in their own modest home, but in the houses of wealthier families across town. She'd take young Jeannie with her sometimes, and while her mother worked, Jeannie would sit on the front porches of those grand houses, imagining a life beyond the gray smoke of the mill town. There were no connections to Nashville, no fancy music agents knocking at their door. There was only the crackle of a country radio station that came in clearer on Saturday nights when the mill was quiet, and a mind bursting with dreams that seemed almost dangerous in their intensity. Jeannie would stay up late, long after her parents had gone to bed, scribbling lyrics by candlelight on whatever scraps of paper she could find, the backs of grocery receipts, the margins of old newspapers, anywhere words could live. At just 16, she took a chance and mailed some lyrics to a publisher in Nashville. She'd saved for weeks to afford the postage, carefully typing out her best songs on a borrowed typewriter at the local library. As you might expect, she got no reply, not a single word. But Jeannie wasn't the type to give up. In fact, that silence only made her more determined. She told herself that if they wouldn't listen to her words on paper, they'd have to hear her voice in person. A few years later, at 21, she packed one suitcase and a typewriter that had seen better days, its keys slightly stuck, the ribbon faded but still functional, and pointed her car south. It was a 1957 Chevrolet that her father had helped her buy with his savings, the first time he'd ever spent money on anything that wasn't strictly necessary for survival. The day she left, her mother pressed a red scarf into her hands, the only beautiful thing she owned, and whispered, "Don't let them make you small." Truth be told, by the time she rolled into Tennessee, her wallet was nearly empty, but her spirit was full. The journey had taken longer than expected. Her car had broken down twice, and she'd slept in it one night at a rest stop, watching the stars through the cracked windshield, wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. But when she finally saw the Nashville skyline at dawn, something inside her settled. This was where she was meant to be. She worked whatever odd job she could find, waitressing at diners where the grease smell never quite left her clothes, cleaning hotel rooms where country stars stayed without ever knowing she was there, folding their clothes and emptying their ashtrays while dreaming of the day they'd know her name. She crashed in borrowed rooms, sleeping on couches and floors, once even in a storage closet above a music shop where the owner took pity on her. And she spent her nights writing songs, her typewriter clacking away in the darkness, creating melodies that seemed to pour out of some deep well inside her. She sang in dusty little bars where most people weren't even listening, where the crowd was more interested in their whiskey than her words. She performed in dive joints where the microphone feedback would screech, and drunken men would heckle her between songs. She sang at county fairs and church socials, anywhere that would have her. There were nights she'd perform for tips that barely covered her gas money home. There were nights she'd sing to empty rooms, just the bartender and her own reflection in the mirror behind the bar. But she never stopped. She couldn't. Then one night, everything changed. In a smoky club on the edge of town, a place called the Bluebird Tavern that smelled of stale beer and broken dreams, a man heard her sing. He was sitting in the back corner, almost invisible in the shadows, nursing a bourbon and reading through contracts. He'd heard 1,000 voices before, most of them forgettable, just another hopeful kid with a guitar and a dream. But when Jeannie opened her mouth, he put down his pen. He heard the raw power in her voice, the honesty that couldn't be faked or taught, in a song that would soon become the massive hit, Don't Touch Me. The song wasn't sweet or safe. It was about boundaries and dignity, about a woman saying no and meaning it. It was dangerous in 1966, radical even, and that's exactly why it worked. Within weeks of its release, it was climbing the charts. Within months, Jeannie Seely's name was on everyone's lips. Just like that, Jeannie Seely was on the radio. The awards started rolling in, and the money came with them. She won her first Grammy, standing on that stage in a borrowed dress, tears streaming down her face as she thanked her parents back in Pennsylvania. She bought her mother a house, a real house with new floors that didn't need scrubbing on hands and knees. She paid off her father's debts and sent him to a doctor who could help with his lungs. For the first time in her life, she wasn't hungry, wasn't struggling, wasn't invisible. Respect, well, that was a different story. Here's the thing, Jeannie didn't fit the mold. She wore her skirts a little shorter and her eyeliner a little bolder. She told jokes from the stage, real jokes with punchlines that made audiences roar with laughter, not the safe, scripted banter that female performers were supposed to stick to. She wasn't afraid to talk back when producers tried to control her set lists or when executives suggested she smile more and sing less. She didn't call powerful men sir just because they expected it, didn't lower her eyes or soften her voice in their presence. And worst of all, from their point of view, she sang with a fire that felt a little too real, a little too threatening. Her songs weren't sweet little stories of heartbreak where the woman pined away for a man who didn't deserve her. They were storms of feeling, all about desire, guilt, and power. They were about women who made their own choices, even the wrong ones, and lived with the consequences on their own terms. When she first walked onto the sacred Opry stage in 1967, she was given a list of rules. It was handed to her by a stern-faced woman in a pressed suit who looked her up and down with obvious disapproval. No dancing, no showing too much skin, and absolutely no talking back. The woman waited for acknowledgement, pen poised to check off that Jeannie understood. She just nodded, smiled politely, and went on to do every single one of those things. Not out of malice, but because music couldn't be contained by someone else's fear. Behind the curtain, the men in charge were stumped. She was too good to get rid of, her records sold too well, her performances brought in too many ticket buyers, but way too bold for them to feel comfortable with. They tried to box her in, giving her terrible time slots, the graveyard shift at 11 p.m. when half the audience had already gone home, and pairing her with performers who didn't give her an ounce of respect. These were men who would refuse to shake her hand before going on stage together, who would make crude jokes during rehearsals loud enough for her to hear, but quiet enough that they could deny it if challenged. They would whisper insults just loud enough for her to hear, calling her difficult, calling her worse things when they thought she was out of earshot. She'd walk into the green room, and conversations would stop mid-sentence. She'd suggest a song for her set, and be told it wasn't appropriate without any explanation why. But Jeannie kept showing up night after night, week after week, year after year. She learned to tune out the whispers, to hold her head high when men twice her age treated her like she was nothing. Her grit paid off when she became the first woman to ever regularly host the Grand Ole Opry in 1969. It was a groundbreaking moment, a crack in the glass ceiling that had seemed unbreakable. People cheered, and she smiled for the cameras. Her makeup perfect, her dress impeccable, every inch the professional entertainer. Newspapers ran stories calling her a trailblazer, a pioneer, proof that women could hold their own in country music's most sacred space. But nobody saw the price she was paying. Nobody knew about the panic attacks she'd have before going on stage, sitting in her dressing room with her hands shaking, trying to breathe. Nobody saw the way she'd flinch when heavy footsteps approached her dressing room door. Nobody knew about the nights she'd drive home in tears, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white, questioning whether any of it was worth it. Because that was the same year she was first called down to room 6B, and the first time she seriously considered walking away from it all for good. The summons. You didn't get an invitation to room 6B. You got a summons. It happened in early 1971 on a night when a fierce storm had knocked out the power in half the Opry house. The thunder was so loud it rattled the old building's bones, and lightning split the sky outside the tall windows. The main stage lights flickered and died, plunging the theater into darkness for exactly 7 seconds that felt like an eternity. Women in the audience screamed. Musicians on stage stood frozen, their instruments silent. But the backup generators roared to life, so fast the audience barely noticed, and the show went on as if nothing had happened. Backstage, however, the brief moment of darkness changed everything. In that pocket of blackness, in those 7 seconds when no one could see, a stagehand silently slipped Jeannie a folded piece of paper. His hand was cold, his touch quick, and he was gone before the lights came back. She didn't even see his face. It didn't have any words on it, just a room number and time. Room 6B, 10:47 p.m. She'd never heard of it. She'd been working at the Opry for years by then, knew every green room, every supply closet, every shortcut through the maze of hallways. But room 6B? Nothing. Looking around, she realized it wasn't listed on any of the official maps or hallway signs that guided artists through the maze-like backstage area. She asked another performer, casually, carefully, if they knew where room 6B was. The woman's face went pale, and she walked away without answering. This place was different. It was part of what insiders called the Island, a secluded windowless section of the building where the real power operated far from the public eye. It was where decisions were made, where careers were shaped and broken, where the public face of the Grand Ole Opry met its private reality. She walked past the familiar green rooms, their doors open, filled with laughter and guitar tuning and the comfortable chaos of performers getting ready. She walked past the costume storage with its racks of sequin gowns and rhinestone-studded suits. And then the hallway changed. The carpet ended. The walls were no longer decorated with photos of stars. The air grew still and smelled of old paper and stale tobacco, mixed with something else, something like fear. And there it was. No nameplate, not even a sign, just a plain wooden door with a tarnished brass knob that looked like it hadn't been polished in decades. A faint, strange hum came from behind it, a sound like radio static or maybe even quiet breathing. She stood there for a full minute, her hand hovering over that knob, every instinct screaming at her to turn around, to run, to get in her car and drive back to Pennsylvania and never look back. But she'd come too far to run now. Taking a deep breath, she turned the knob and opened the door. The room inside was small and suffocating, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with no windows and walls that seemed to absorb sound. There was one dim lamp casting sickly yellow light, one hardback chair, and one man sitting in it. He didn't bother to introduce himself. He didn't have to. He was one of the quiet bosses, the kind of man whose name never appeared in the papers, whose face wasn't on any album covers, but who ran the Opry like his own private kingdom. He was older, maybe 60, with silver hair slicked back and eyes that revealed nothing. He wore an expensive suit, and there was a cigar burning in an ashtray beside him, its smoke curling up toward the yellowed ceiling. He looked her over slowly, deliberately, not with admiration, but with a cold, calculating stare, like he was appraising livestock at an auction. Then he asked her a question. It was a question so personal and so chilling that she has never repeated it aloud to this day. Not to journalists, not to friends, not even to herself in the mirror. Her answer didn't even matter because what he was giving her wasn't a request. It was an unmistakable warning about her career and her place at the Opry, about what could be taken from her, about how quickly a star could be erased. 11 minutes later, Jeannie walked out of that room. She was pale and completely silent, her lips pressed together so tightly they'd lost their color. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't even look at anyone. Instead, she walked straight through the backstage area, past confused stagehand and concerned performers, pushed through the heavy back door, and walked out to the gravel parking lot. The storm had passed, but the ground was still wet, reflecting the parking lot lights and puddles that looked like portals to somewhere else. She took off the dress she was wearing, a beautiful blue sequin gown that was one of her favorites, the one she'd worn when she won her Grammy, the one that had cost more money than her father made in 3 months at the mill. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely work the zipper. And right there, under the moonlight, she set it on fire. She pulled a lighter from her purse, the same lighter she used to light her cigarettes when the pressure got too much, and she held the flame to the delicate fabric. It caught quickly, the sequins melting and popping in the heat, the blue fabric curling and blackening. A janitor who saw the smoke later said she just stood there watching the flames eat the fabric, as if she were watching a person disappear. From that day forward, she never wore the color blue on stage again. Not even a hint of it, not in her accessories or her makeup or her jewelry. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was only the beginning of their attempts to control her. The slow erosion. After that night, a subtle chill settled over Jeannie's career. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing she could easily point to or prove in a court of law. Instead, it was a series of small, calculated moves designed to put her in her place, to remind her constantly that her success existed only because they allowed it. All of a sudden, her set list would be shortened just minutes before she went on stage, giving her no time to adjust or prepare. The host who introduced her would conveniently forget to mention her latest hit record, robbing her of the moment when the audience would cheer in recognition. Sound checks that were scheduled would mysteriously be canceled, leaving her to perform with whatever levels the board operator felt like giving her that night. Whispers started to spread through the backstage hallways like poison in the water. Rumors that Jeannie was difficult or demanding began to circulate, stories that she'd thrown tantrums or made unreasonable requests, none of which were true, but all of which stuck. Young performers started avoiding her, afraid that association with her would taint their own careers. Musicians who'd played with her for years suddenly became unavailable when she needed a backup band. One Saturday night, a producer pulled her from a primetime show at the last minute. She was already in costume, already mic'd up, already standing in the wings waiting for her cue. He replaced her with a male newcomer who ended up forgetting half the words to his own songs, who stumbled through his set to polite but unenthusiastic applause. The audience had come to see her, and they left disappointed. But it didn't matter. It was a clear message, and everyone backstage understood it perfectly. But Jeannie kept coming back. She kept hosting her segments with that megawatt smile, kept singing her heart out even when her microphone was turned down too low, kept being professional even when professionalism wasn't being returned. She kept smiling, that radiant smile for the audience who knew nothing of the drama behind the velvet curtain, who saw only the glamour and the spotlight and the applause. One evening, she gathered her courage and confronted the very same man from room 6B in the hallway. She'd rehearsed what she'd say, planned out her words carefully, tried to strike the right balance between assertive and respectful. She asked him directly why her opportunities were shrinking, why her name was being left off promotional materials, why she felt like she was being pushed out. He simply looked at her, his face betraying no emotion, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, and said 5 words she would never forget. He told her to be careful, that she was not untouchable. Then he walked away, leaving her standing alone in that hallway, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. That was the night she started locking her dressing room door. And it was the night she started writing letters. Some of them she mailed to trusted friends with instructions to keep them safe. But most she kept for herself, hiding them in an old shoe box under her bed, a battered box that had once held a pair of winter boots her mother had sent her. These weren't diary entries filled with feelings about her day or her struggles. They weren't lyrics for a new song, raw emotions waiting to be set to music. And they certainly weren't pleas for sympathy or understanding. Truth be told, they were records meticulously typed out on thin onion skin paper with her old manual typewriter, the same one she'd brought with her from Pennsylvania all those years ago. Each one was dated and signed. Each letter was a factual snapshot of something she wasn't allowed to say out loud. She documented the sideways glances, the veiled warnings that could never be proven, and the stage cues that were mysteriously changed to throw her off at the last second. She wrote about the nights her microphone failed to turn on and the time the main curtain was deliberately kept down while she walked out to a silent stage, standing there in the spotlight while the audience murmured in confusion. She wrote about the phone calls that came at 2 a.m. with no one on the other end, the flat tires she got every time she parked at the Opry for 2 weeks straight, the way her fan mail would mysteriously disappear before it reached her. She wrote about the contracts that were rewritten without her knowledge, the royalty checks that came up short with no explanation. Jeannie wrote it all down, every little slight, every act of humiliation, and every single name of every single person involved. She kept these letters locked in that shoe box, wrapped in a faded red scarf her mother had given her, the one beautiful thing that had come with her from Pennsylvania. She called it her insurance policy, though at the time, she wasn't even sure it would ever be worth anything. For her, it wasn't about getting revenge, it wasn't about destroying the men who were trying to destroy her. It was about having proof, about having something solid and real that couldn't be denied or explained away. Because one of the cruelest games the Opry played with its women was to make them think it was all in their heads. They wanted you to believe you were being too sensitive or taking things too personally, that this was just how the business worked, and you needed to develop thicker skin. But she knew better, and she was already thinking about what she'd seen happen to other women who dared to have an opinion, who dared to push back even a little. They disappeared, their careers evaporating like morning mist, and everyone pretended it was because they couldn't handle the pressure or because their talent wasn't enough. But Jeannie knew the truth, and she was writing it down. The visitor at sunset. Years turned into decades. The shoe box remained locked, a silent witness under her bed through moves and marriages, through the rise and fall of her career, through the slow fade from stardom into comfortable obscurity. The letters inside yellowed with age, but the words remained sharp, undeniable, true. Then in 1991, disaster struck. A fire broke out in her second home in the middle of the night, started by faulty wiring in the walls. The smoke alarm woke her just in time. She barely made it out in her nightgown, standing on a lawn in bare feet, while firefighters battled the flames. While most of the house was saved, her bedroom was engulfed in flames. The bed she'd slept in reduced to charred metal springs, the walls blackened, everything she owned apparently destroyed. By some miracle, the shoebox survived. The heat had melted the red scarf into the metal, fusing fabric and box into a single strange artifact. But the lock held firm. Inside, buried under the scarf's remains, every single one of those letters was perfectly preserved, as if they'd been protected by some force beyond understanding. That night, sitting on her porch, surrounded by the smell of ash and smoke, her hands still trembling from shock and adrenaline, she finally opened the box. The firefighters had left. The neighbors had gone home. She was alone with the ghosts of her past. As she read the words she had typed so long ago, it felt like she was reading about someone else's life, a life that had been trapped, controlled, and nearly erased. She read about nights she'd forgotten, insults she'd buried, fears she'd tried to move past. She didn't cry. She was beyond tears by then. She just whispered into the night air that she knew. She'd always known she wasn't crazy. It was at that moment she made a new plan. She wouldn't burn the letters like she'd burned that blue dress. She would wait for the perfect moment to use them. She would wait until she had nothing left to lose, until no one could threaten her career because her career was already over, until no one could hurt her because she'd already survived everything they could throw at her. As she approached her 90th birthday, that moment finally arrived. It came with a soft knock on her door just after sunset on a Tuesday evening in late spring. Jeannie was in her kitchen making her evening tea, the same ritual she'd performed for decades, Earl Grey with honey, in the same chipped mug she'd had since the 70s. She rarely had visitors anymore. Most people her age were gone, buried in the ground she'd one day joined them in, or had long since stopped calling, their voices lost to time and distance. But this knock felt different. It was hesitant, almost respectful, not the aggressive pounding of someone trying to sell her something or the casual rap of a neighbor. It was the knock of someone who knew they might not be welcome, but desperately hoped they would be. Standing on her porch was a young woman, no older than 30, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She had wide, nervous eyes and was clutching a folder to her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. She introduced herself with only a first name, Sarah, explaining that she was a graduate student writing a thesis about the forgotten women of country music. She had driven 6 hours just for the chance to speak with Jeannie, had tried calling but couldn't find a number, had shown up unannounced because she didn't know what else to do. Jeannie was about to politely send the young woman away. She was tired, had heard these requests 100 times before, and had told her stories of the old days more times than she could count. They always said they wanted the truth, but what they really wanted was nostalgia, safe stories about the good old days that didn't upset anyone or challenge anything. But then the visitor said 2 small words that made the entire world seem to stop. Room 6B. It was a name Jeannie had not heard spoken out loud in 50 years, a name she thought had died with the men who'd used it. Nobody knew that name. It wasn't in any official records, wasn't on any blueprints or documents. You only knew it if you had been called there, if you had been summoned into the shadows of the Grand Ole Opry's hidden world, if you had stood in that suffocating little room and felt your life balanced on a razor's edge. A wave of shock must have shown on Jeannie's face because the young woman quickly opened the folder she was holding so tightly. Her hands were shaking. She pulled out a copy of a letter, the paper worn from being handled, photocopied from the original. The moment Jeannie saw it, a cold chill ran down her spine. She knew that typing, recognized every quirk of those letters, the way these sat slightly higher than the other letters, the way the O was slightly filled in. It was hers from her old manual typewriter. The date at the top of the page read June 15th, 1971. It was a perfect record of her second visit to that awful room, typed out with shaking hands in the hours after she'd left, when the fear was still fresh and her resolve to document everything was stronger than her desire to forget. The letter described a terrible deal she was forced to accept, a kind of handshake agreement made in the dark, an understanding that was never written down but was binding nonetheless. It even mentioned the final warning she received, a clear message that if she ever spoke about what happened, her career would be over before she could even finish her next song on stage. More than that, she'd been told the people she loved would find their lives becoming very difficult in ways that couldn't be traced back to anyone. Her parents in Pennsylvania, her sister, her friends, everyone she cared about would pay the price for her big mouth. Jeannie looked up, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, feel it in her throat. She had to ask the girl where on earth she found this piece of the past, this ghost that should have stayed buried. The story that came out was almost too strange to believe. As it turned out, the letter was found by pure accident. The young researcher was looking through the Opry's private files, archives that weren't open to the public, documents that were supposed to be destroyed decades ago, but somehow survived. She was in a dusty, forgotten closet filled with old stage plans, looking for information about set designs from the 60s. Tucked away inside a roll of diagrams for a Christmas special that never aired was Jeannie's letter, folded small and hidden. A forgotten employee must have hidden it there years and years ago. Someone who knew what was happening, who couldn't stop it, but couldn't let it be completely forgotten either. Someone with a conscience buried in fear. The researcher said she had to read it 3 times before she understood just how important it was, how explosive it could be. And then she'd spent weeks trying to decide what to do with it, whether to include it in her thesis or bring it directly to Jeannie. Jeannie's voice was barely a whisper when she asked why the girl had brought it to her, why she hadn't just written about it or given it to a journalist or published it online where everyone could see. The young woman looked Jeannie straight in the eye, and her reason was simple and powerful. She believed that what happened to Jeannie was not the only time something like this had occurred. She was sure other women had been silenced in similar ways, their voices stolen, their stories buried. And she worried it could easily happen again if someone didn't speak up, if someone with credibility, with a name people recognized, didn't break the silence once and for all. She said she'd found hints of other letters, references to other rooms, other women who disappeared from the Opry stages without explanation. But this letter, Jeannie's letter, was the only solid proof she'd found. and she wanted Jeannie to decide what to do with it, because it was her story, her trauma, her truth to tell or keep silent. That night, long after the visitor left, promising to return the next day, Jeannie sat alone in her quiet house. The tea had gone cold on the counter. The sun had set completely, leaving her in darkness. She didn't turn on the lights. She just sat there, that photocopied letter in her hands, reading her own word from 50 years ago. For the first time in a very long time, she knew her years of silence were finally coming to an end. The past was no longer just a memory locked in a shoe box under her bed. It had come knocking on her front door, asking for the truth to be told, begging for the silence to be broken. And she realized, sitting there in the dark, that she was finally ready. Ready to tell the whole truth. Ready to name names. Ready to pull back the velvet curtain and show the world what had been hidden behind it for so long. She walked to her bedroom and pulled out the shoe box. The melted red scarf still fused to its surface. She opened it and spread the letters across her kitchen table, dozens of them, a paper trail of abuse and control and systematic silencing. This was her insurance policy, and it was time to cash it in. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more. It leaves us with one final question. How many other secrets are still hidden behind the Opry's velvet curtain? And how many other women are waiting for someone to find their letters?